Hi everyone. Today our video will be on the topic the Apprentices Act 1961. So let's look in detail on the Apprentices Act 1961, starting with the objective of the act. To impose statutory obligation of all employers in the notified industries to engage apprentices in the ratio prescribed for the designated trades. That is the objective of the act. That is, employers engage apprentices in their trade, and this act shall be for notifying the industries which are allowed to engage apprentices and the ratio in which they can be engaged. Now coming to important definitions. Who is an apprentice? Before coming to the definition given under the Act on apprentice, let us see what is an apprentice in normal terms. An apprentice is a trainee who learns a trade or profession under a skilled worker or employer for a fixed period. They typically combine on-the-job training with classroom instruction or theoretical learning. So basically, apprentice is a person who learns under a skillful trainer both his job and his theoretical knowledge as standing under this trained person. That is who's an apprentice. So apprentice, as given under the definition of the act, is a person who is undergoing apprenticeship training in pursuance of a contract of apprentice. A simple definition, that is, there will be a contract of apprenticeship and a person who is undergoing this type of training for both technical know-how as well as the practical knowledge in that field of trade is a person called apprentice under this act. What is apprenticeship training? A course of training in any industry or establishment undergone in pursuance of a contract of apprenticeship and under prescribed terms and conditions which may be different for different categories of apprentices. And finally, apprenticeship scheme, a person who shall not be qualified for being as engaged an apprentice unless he is not less than 14 years of age and satisfies such standards of education and physical fitness as may be prescribed. So to become an apprentice, a person should be minimum 14 years of age and he should have, as required by the profession he chooses, as required by the trade he chooses, he should have the physical fitness and the standards of education to qualify for being an apprentice. So that's about important definitions. Coming to the next slide, apprenticeship regulations. Contract of apprenticeship. According to Indian Majority Act, a person attains majority at the age of 18, and if he or she is a minor, the guardian must execute a contract or apprenticeship with the employer in the prescribed form, which will be registered with the concerned apprenticeship advisor. The act also provides for novation. What is novation? Novation is a legal concept that involves the substitution of one party or obligation in a contract with another with the consent of all parties involved. That is, one person will be going out, and instead of him or her, another person will be coming in, but all the other parties should have consented for this substitution. It essentially replaces one contractual obligation with another, releasing the original party from their obligation and transferring them to a new party. So this act allows novation of the contract of apprenticeship, and the period of apprenticeship training for both trade apprentices and graduate or technician apprentices should be specified in the contract of apprenticeship. That is, whether it be trade apprenticeship, that is, you are learning a trade to carry out how a trade is done, or it is a technical field, like you are learning some technical jobs like plumbing, welding, etc. You are learning such type of technical apprentices, then the specified time should be mentioned in the contract of apprenticeship. Both the employer and the apprentice can terminate the contract of apprenticeship before the expiry of the period of apprenticeship training, but it should be done through the apprenticeship advisor, and the party responsible for termination will have to pay compensation to the other party. Now coming to ratio of trade apprentices, central government is given the power to determine for each designated trade the ratio of trade apprentices to workers other than unskilled workers in the trade. So the ratio will be the number of apprentices is to skilled workers. Unskilled workers will not be counted. And finally, practical training arrangements. Every employer is required to make suitable arrangements in their workshop for the purpose of imparting a course of practical training to every apprentice engaged by them in accordance with the program approved by the apprenticeship advisor.
Where the number of employees is 250 or more, the cost of basic training shall be borne entirely by the establishment. In cases where the number of employees is less than 250, basic training must be imparted in training institutions set up by the government. The employer shall bear the entire recurring cost, including the cost of stipends incurred in connection with practical training, including basic training of trade apprentices. If the employer employs less than 250 workers, both the employer and the government are required to share the expenses equally. A trade apprentice who is undergoing practical training in an establishment will also have to undergo a course on related instruction. Those are the apprentice regulations we have under the Act. And obligations of employers. Coming to obligations of employers, there are different types of obligations of employers given under the Act. First one is to provide, the primary thing is to provide apprentice with training in his trade. That is why the apprentice have come under his supervision. So he have to provide training in his trade in order to, in accordance with the provisions of the Act. To place in charge of training a duly qualified person if the employer is not himself qualified in the trade. If that person or the apprentice, the person under whom the apprentice have come is not a qualified person, he have to make arrangements to train the apprentice by a qualified person. And finally, to carry out his obligations under the contract of apprenticeship. So there are different kinds of obligations under the contract of apprenticeship for an employer. First one is providing training. Employers are required to provide suitable training facilities. We have already looked at that. Maintaining records. Employers must maintain records of progress of training of each apprentice in their establishment. Third one is compliance with standards. Employers should ensure that the training provides meets with the standards prescribed under the Apprenticeship Act and relevant regulations. Payment of wages. Apprenticeship are not, the apprentices don't get wages, they get stipends, and so they, if there is a clause of contract for paying stipends, the employer should pay them stipends. Safety and welfare. The employer has a duty to ensure the safety of and welfare of the apprentice by taking care that it is the working environment is safe during the training period. And finally, granting leave. Employers should grant leave to the apprentices as per the provisions of the Act and any applicable rules or regulations. And upon completion of the apprenticeship period, employers may offer the employment to apprentice if mutually agreed upon, but it is not obligatory. Those are the obligations of employers under the Apprenticeship Act. Coming to the rights and obligations of apprentice. The rights is already given here. The employer is required to pay to every apprentice during the period of apprenticeship training. If apprentices are undergoing training in the factory, of provisions of chapter 3, 4 and 5 of Apprentices Act 1948 shall be applicable to them insofar as their health, safety and welfare are concerned. If personal injury is caused to an apprentice, the employer is liable to pay compensation under the Employees Compensation Act. That is, if the apprentice is getting injured at the site during the training process, the compensation is to be paid by the employer to the apprentice. An apprentice is entitled to casual leave, medical leave and extraordinary leave. 90 days maternity leave without stipend has been allowed to female apprentices. Those are the rights of apprentice. And coming to obligations of apprentice, to attend classes regularly. The apprentice have to attend classes regularly and carry out lawful orders of his employers or superiors, to carry out his obligations under the contract of apprenticeship, to learn his trade diligently and endeavor to become a skillful craftsman. And finally, in all matters of conduct and discipline, the apprentice will be governed by the rules and regulations of the establishment. Status of apprentice. What is the status of apprentice? First one is definition of apprentice. We have already seen the definition of apprentice in the first slide. An apprentice is a trainee and not considered as a worker. Labor laws provisions do not automatically apply to apprentices unless specifically made applicable. Now, next one is inclusion in Industrial Disputes Act. An apprentice is included in the definition of a workman under Industrial Disputes Act. Though he is not considered as a worker, he is included in case of Industrial Disputes Act. Exclusion from other acts. He is excluded from the definitions of an employee under several acts such as Payment of Bonus Act 1965, Payment of Gratuity Act 1972, Employees State Insurance Act 1948, and Employees Provident Fund and Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1952. Finally, employers' obligations. Employers are obligated to maintain records of the progress of training in their establishment. We saw that in the last slide. Coming to the next slide, settlement of disputes. The first one is dispute resolution. If any dispute arises between the employer and the apprentice about the interpretation of the contract of apprenticeship, it may be referred to the apprenticeship advisor for a decision. So if both of them are not, both of them cannot come to a conclusion and are in a dispute, they can give the problem or present the problem before the apprenticeship advisor. At the end of the period of training, an apprentice is required to appear for a final All India Trade Test conducted by the National Council for Training in Vocational Trades. So after this training, there will be a test exam, and only if he passes that, he is qualified for working. The scheme provides for the grant of certificates of proficiency to successful apprentices. That's a certificate of completion also. Next is, it is not obligatory on the part of the employer to offer any employment to an apprentice who has completed apprenticeship training in his establishment, nor it is obligatory on the part of the apprentice to accept any employment under the employer on successful completion of the training. So neither the employer has an obligation to provide employment to the apprentice, nor the apprentice has an obligation to be an employer under the apprenticeship trainer. Finally, the contract of apprenticeship contains a condition that the apprentice shall, after the completion of apprenticeship training, serve the employer. The employee shall, on such completion, be bound to offer employment to the apprentice. Shall be if there is a contract. If there is a contract between the two of them to offer employment and to be in the employer and to be the employee of the other, then it should be complied upon. And next one, administration. The Act provides for constitutions of councils, appointments of apprentice and apprenticeship advisors, and specifies their powers and functions. The Act establishes certain authorities such as the National Council, the Central Apprenticeship Council, State Council, State Apprenticeship Council, All India Council, Regional Boards, Board and State Council for Technical Education, Central Apprenticeship Advisor, and the State Apprenticeship Advisor. Coming to the next slide deals with offences and penalties. An employee shall be punished with imprisonment up to 6 months or with fine or both if he engages a person as an apprentice who is not qualified to be so engaged. For example, if he is less than 14 years of age. Next is, fails to carry out the terms and conditions of a contract of apprenticeship or contravenes in the provisions of the Act relating to the number of apprentices which he is required to engage under those provisions. If these provisions are not complied with by the employer, he will have to undergo imprisonment up to 6 months or with fine or with both. That is the offences and penalties. Coming to the next slide, miscellaneous. We have reached the end of this presentation. The Act also deals with cognizance of offences, delegation of powers, and protection of action taken in good faith. Under Section 37 of the Act, after consultation with the Central Apprenticeship Council by notification in the Official Gazette, made rules known as Central Apprenticeship Council Rule 1961. Thanks for bearing with me.